Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Kunstakademien, to the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. So we had a very long and nice summer. I hope that you also have been enjoying yourselves. And now we're back with a very, very charged series, started last week actually. And we are very pleased to launch our first J Talks for the season with Adam Gopnik. Adam has been here twice before as our guest. He was here when we did Jewish New York and also the homage to Philip Roth. Both were in 2018. And we're very pleased on the occasion of the publication of his first it's the first book that is translated into Swedish and which was published by Fri Tanke. This is why Adam is here. He was invited by us and by Fri Tanke to speak about the book, which he did last evening a bit at Schola Teatro, and we had a nice conversation with a few writers. But this evening is a bit different. This evening we wanted to have a small, intimate portrait conversation with Adam, and it is Per Svensson. Per is, you know him, he's been in our programs many times. He's a writer and journalist. Adam, is also an author and a critic, and he's been writing for many, many years for The New Yorker. He has many other interests, and which I hope that Per will touch upon. I just had to drag him from the piano upstairs. He was sitting and playing. I had no idea. Anyway, Adam, welcome again to us. And Per. So after the conversation, which is about 50 minutes or so, you are welcome to the cafe. We will have some wine and something to eat, and Adam will be signing his book. And I wish you all a very meaningful evening, and I hope to see you a lot this coming season. Thank you.
So, your book is called 1000 små framsteg, Liberalism ett moraliskt äventyr. In Swedish, it's called 1000 small sanities in English. And it's about, about liberalism. We could return to that in the broadest sense of the word. But I will start with, in the book you're describing liberalism as a rhinoceros, a noshörning. And the ideological opponents of liberalism as believers in unicorns, in enhörningar. Could you develop that? The rhinoceros, noshörningen, and the unicorns, enhörningarna.
With great pleasure. But first let me just say what a joy it is for me to be back here in Stockholm. This is the third time that my dear friend Lizzie has brought me here, and each time it's an extraordinary thing. I want to thank you all for your extraordinary tolerance in listening to my English rather than to your Swedish. This would never happen in France, let me assure you. And to be in this beautiful room with Per. I have not been in the presence of so many nude people since they closed the Turkish baths in New York at the beginning of the pandemic. So when I was trying to think about the kind of heraldic image of liberalism, I fell on the idea of the rhinoceros, exactly because it's in opposition to the unicorn. We think of unicorns as ideal animals. They're the animals we find in the unicorn tapestries at the Cluny Museum in Paris. They're the ultimate search for the shimmering ideal creature. And the unicorn seemed to me a perfect symbolic animal for all the utopian visions that fill the history of political philosophy and of social idealism. But when you think about it, what is a unicorn actually? Well, a unicorn is a traveler's tale about a rhinoceros. The people would come back from actually seeing a rhinoceros and say, I saw this amazing animal. It had a horn right in the center of its forehead. It was astonishing. They said, oh, what else was it? It was kind of silver, and it was beautiful, and it was thin. It was you make a cosmetic improvement when you tell a tale about an animal you've seen. But the reality behind the unicorn was the rhinoceros. And in the same way, the reality behind the shimmering, idealized image of utopian schemes is the ugly, squat, muddy, ridiculous image of liberal government. Liberal government is like liberal democracy. Liberalism, in the very broad sense that we're talking about it in this book and here tonight, is a rhinoceros. It's not instantly appealing. It does not make the best image for itself. It does not belong very often on a banner or in a tapestry. And yet it's an incredibly formidable and effective animal. If you want to be safe in Africa, sooner have a rhinoceros on your side, a real rhinoceros, than an imaginary unicorn. And in the same way, it seems to me that liberalism, in that very broad sense, the forces that have produced countries like contemporary Sweden, the United States until quite recently, have been successful in producing what are, I say unapologetically, the most peaceful and prosperous and pluralist societies that poor, suffering mankind has ever known. Yeah. And proudly, I'm proud to say, they're not ideal, they're rhinoceros countries. So that's where I got the image of the rhinoceros. And when I originally wrote this book and sent it to my publisher in New York, I called it the Rhinoceros Manifesto. And they said, we can't publish a book called The Rhinoceros Manifesto because all you'll be doing is what I just did. It's explaining to people why you called it The Rhinoceros Manifesto. The only country in which the book was published under its original title, The Rhinoceros Manifesto, was in Italy, where it's called Il Manifesto Rinascere. But they saved the title by giving it the subtitle, Liberalismo e Amore. Liberalism and Love, which is not a bad subtitle at all, because the book is very much about liberalism and love, very much about liberalism and love. So I was very proud of it until I realized that every book in Italy is given a subtitle, something e amore. So I was not being singled out.
Yeah, and as you said, it's very much about love. You're telling a couple of love stories, and one of them is including a rhinoceros. In fact,
yes,
the love story between John Stuart Mill, arguably the most famous liberal in the world, and Harriet Taylor, his companion. And why has it to do with the rhinoceros?
His companion. It's a beautiful liberal love story. John Stuart Mill, the greatest liberal philosopher, certainly in the English language, was a lonely and somewhat brilliant, precocious, but somewhat awkward man, and he fell desperately in love with a woman named Harriet Taylor in London. Harriet, unfortunately, was already unhappily married with 3 children, so they couldn't immediately begin to live together or come together. This is in an era, right, when divorce is almost impossible. So they would meet clandestinely, and where they loved to meet most was in front of the rhinoceros cage at the London Zoo. They had just brought this is the kind of research you do when you're writing a book like this. In 1824, I think it is, they brought the rhinoceros to London. In the 1830s, John and Harriet began to meet in front of the rhinoceros cage, and they would send each other cryptic little notes. Do you want to visit our old friend rhinoceros today? And they had the brains that only philosophers could have to know that nobody would notice the 2 of them canoodling on the bench because everyone would be looking at the rhinoceros. And on that bench and in their relationship, 2 things happened. First of all, they fell in love. They actually went to Paris together for a week. And we don't know what happened, but we can imagine. But they also realized that they could not at that point get married, that she couldn't leave her children, he couldn't betray her husband, who was a friend, and they made this very complicated, personal, emotional compromise in love, which in an odd way was the kind of platform or pedestal for their larger vision of the essential compromises we make in life. And on that bench as well, they began to imagine these 2 great books, which for me are the foundation of the liberal vision, certainly in English and maybe more broadly. One is a famous book John Stuart Mill put his name on, though they collaborated on everything, called On Liberty, which is a great testament for the necessity of unconstrained speech, not acceptable speech, not mostly unconstrained speech, but for freedom of expression in its most absolute form. But at the same time that they were working together on this manifesto for free speech, they were also working on a manifesto for women's equality, the book On the Subjection of Women, which was the first book not just in English, but really in the Western world, which made a claim not just for women's suffrage, not just for women's right to vote, not just for women's participation in some spheres, broader spheres of life, but for women's absolute equality in every imaginable sphere of life. It's the most radical feminist statement of its time. Two amazing visionary works, both of them published eventually in the 1860s. They finally were able to get married, and they were briefly, tragically married for too short a time. But what fascinated me about this pair is exactly that by many of our contemporary explanations, we say, oh, these two things are in opposition, right? You can either emphasize, as in America, conservatives, what we call conservatives also do, the rights of the individual, or you can emphasize the social justice that we strive for an oppressed class of people. But you can't both believe in the powerful rights of the individual and in social justice for whole classes. And for Mill and Taylor, there was no contradiction between these two things. You only had the possibility of individual liberty if that was your path towards personal fulfillment. That's what they wanted. Mill felt strongly that the reason to be alive was not just to eat more bread and butter or collect riches, but to write poetry and listen to Mozart and look at art. But you couldn't do those things with a clear conscience if other people were prevented from doing it. So the more people who were included in this broadening circle of compassion, this broadening circle of shared consciousness, the deeper your own pleasure would be in those things. So that the right of an individual to be fulfilled was inextricably tied to the possibility of everyone being fulfilled. Bruce Springsteen, you know, the great American singer, composer, and political activist, excuse me, ends his concerts. I don't know if any of you have been to a Springsteen concert. Ends his concerts always with saying, excuse me, nobody wins unless everybody wins. And that's Mill's philosophy of liberalism in a single slogan. And he means it to his audience, meaning that we can't, if some of us are privileged, it doesn't mean anything unless he speaks as a working class boy. Nobody wins unless everybody wins. That's what Mill and Taylor imagined in front of that rhinoceros cage at that moment.
And also the fact that you tell so many love stories, you emphasize very much the sense of belonging, the need for a sense of belonging as a part of liberalism. That goes against the grain, because very often the image of liberalism is quite opposite, that it's a very cold, hyper-rational, that it's just we're all isolated atoms in
we're all
cold space.
Isolated, atomized individuals who engage in a social contract with the state, and that's what the liberal vision
That's not your vision of liberalism.
No, and of course, as you know, Per, one of the immediate impetus for me writing this book was I wanted to write a letter to my daughter about liberalism, about my values that I had learned from my father, from my grandfathers, and so on. And that was the motive, and I wanted exactly, Per, to say to her, when people talk about liberalism, they can make it sound like the most boring contractual business, but behind that are all these stories of human beings who were inspired by a new vision of the possibility of reconciling pluralism, the possibility of everyone having their own view, with shared prosperity. And I wanted her to understand that behind all of those dry concepts, there were genuine, passionate human beings, and passionate human beings engaged with other passionate human beings. So that's why the book is Liberalismo e Amore, why the book is Liberalism and Love.
And the book, as I said, is written as a letter to your daughter, and it's also written as a response to the election 2016 when
Donald
Trump triumphed, and the shock you and your daughter felt at that and so on. And I wonder now, because at that time, he was, after all, considered some kind of a political outsider, and but few believed that he would win. And now he is the almighty emperor of the Republican Party, so shouldn't the shock transform to despair almost?
Yes.
He might come back next time, or somebody like him, one of his clones, or somebody representing him, and so on.
Well, first of all, I will say, because we discussed this before, right? I am a believer in contingency, and exactly because I am a liberal, I believe in the power of the individual for good or ill. And I think that Trump has enormous capacity for ill that is not shared by all of his followers at all, or his co-equals. He's a uniquely empty and malevolent human being. But I do think, yes, that it's an ongoing crisis. That was a moment of shock when my daughter was, everything that she had been taught seemed to be under threat, and I wanted to reassure her as best I can. As always, when we reassure our children, we're reassuring ourselves at the same time, and I certainly was. But yes, we're living through an ongoing political emergency, which is in the United States, certainly, but also clearly is spread around the world. The renaissance of autocratic government and of autocratic visions, of anti-liberal visions, is a defining feature of the world we live in.
I wonder, the basic theme of the book, as is in its title, A Thousand Small Sanities, that small steps are always, or almost always, better than great leaps, so to speak. So I'm going to make a leap now. So you've written several books about your own family, your family life, on Manhattan and in Paris, where you were a correspondent for New Yorker for 5 years. So I wonder, could you see some similarities between liberalism and parenting?
Yes, I think parenting is the great liberal enterprise, though it began long before. I should add, exactly as you suggest, Per, that this book is an essayist book. It's a parent's book in that way. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not really an historian. I'm an amateur historian, as we all are when we read a lot. But so this is a book very much addressed from a father to a child, to a daughter. But yes, in a larger sense, I've written a trilogy of family books. A book called At the Stranger's Gate, about arriving in New York, making a life, then a book called Paris the Moon, about flying to Paris and having children there, and then a book called Through the Children's Gate, about bringing up children in New York in the shadow of 9/11, very, very much. So they're all about the struggle to find pleasure, happiness, value, meaning, above all to find meaning in the difficult circumstances we find, whether they're the pleasurable circumstances of expatriation in Paris or the very demanding circumstances of trying to continue to infuse your children with hope and belief in the long shadow of a transformative terrorist attack and so on. But certainly all of the things that I write have in common an attempt to bear witness to the life of liberal-minded people. I will say without apology, to the life of the bourgeoisie, the North American bourgeoisie, the European bourgeoisie, at a time of crisis. And to a great degree to defend those values, to laugh at them, to have an ironic understanding of their absurdity, of the absurdity of our manners, of the fragility and fallibility at every moment, how ridiculous we can often look and seem. But nonetheless, underlying that is a sense of the value of the world that we share, in the world that our parents have made, in the world that we live in. We're blessed to live lives, for the most part, of relative prosperity, of more or less social peace than human beings have often had in the past. We can devote ourselves to our children. Increasingly, we see our fundamental relationship in the world. I wrote one of my books, which seems to have nothing to do with the problems of family life. It's a book called Angels and Ages, which is about Darwin and Lincoln and the birth of the liberal vision in the 19th century. I will say, without blushes, that it was Philip Roth's favorite of all my books. That was because he thought it was my best book, exactly because without being overtly about these things, it was implicitly about these things. And one of the ideas that's very strong in that book is the idea that we define ourselves less in terms of our vertical relationship to heaven, real or imaginary, than in terms of our horizontal relationship to our children. Our mission in life most often is to say our children are happy, fulfilled, successful. We're Jewish people. We say that they're doctors and lawyers and philosophers and so on. Professors, musicians, whatever it is. But we, as modern people, even if we continue to have some sort of vertical relationship, that's not defining for us as much. It's our horizontal relationship to our future and our children. And that's very much the common thread of my books and my work.
Yeah, because you're the child of two college professors.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry.
Yeah, but their parents were not college
Yes,
professors.
exactly. I am a child very typical of a particular kind of American Jewish intellectual, that my parents were both academics, both intellectuals, but their parents were very simple, wonderful people. I was blessed to know them well, but who got off the boat and started making lives for themselves in Philadelphia and in Montreal. My grandfather was in the wholesale fish business, if that means anything. Then he had a grocery. It's a great story about my grandfather, which no one believes is true, and is true. When he arrived in America from what he always called Russia, though in fact, in retrospect, it was Ukraine
yeah.
that he was coming from. His name it's a very long story. His name in Russian was Anna. And he got to Ellis Island, and he said, and the inspectors, there's a whole genre of American story called Ellis Island stories, right? And most of them are made up. This one happens to be true. He said, they said, you can't call a boy Anna in this country. And they said, well, what are we going to call him? And the inspector said, call him Ellis, after this place. And my grandfather went through his life in America as Ellis Island Gopnik. That was his name on his passport, on his birth certificate. It's the name he's buried under in Florida, of course. But that was the kind of background they had.
Yeah.
And then they went to university. They discovered the world of intellect and learning. My mother became a logician, my father an English professor, and they passed that on to us. Now, I'm immensely proud of having that background, but if I may say, it's not a background of privilege, it's a background of purpose. All of those people were purposeful. I become emotional thinking about this. But as I'm sure so many of your grandparents were purposeful in wanting a better life for their children. And we are the inheritors of their purpose and their sense of purpose.
I heard a podcast with you and your daughter. It was a very interesting podcast. And she's a history student at Harvard.
History student at Harvard, yes.
Yeah. And you talked about what a lot of young students at Harvard talk about privileged groups and
exactly.
so on, being a white privileged member of the white privileged groups. And you reminded her of that, the fact that you are Jewish.
Yes,
Because there was a time when...
There was a time not very long ago, within living memory, when Jews were not allowed at Harvard, or were allowed only in tiny populations of Jews. Bernard Berenson, the greatest of all art connoisseurs, was allowed in kind of on a special pass. So I wanted her to remember that I'm perfectly glad to be called white or whatever anybody wants to call me, but our specificity is that we're Jewish. We may be practicing Jews, we may be secularized Jews, but that's our legacy. And I wanted her to keep that in mind. She accepted that she accepted that correction. And that doesn't mean that we somehow have special privileges as persecuted people. It doesn't mean that we can withdraw from our sense of responsibility to other people. On the contrary, if we have the history of understanding what persecution is, it's our responsibility as liberals and as Jews to expand our circles of compassion, to take in other persecuted people. We've been talking all day about refugees coming to Sweden, the social crises that creates, but also the sense of social responsibility to take in people who are homeless and who are expelled outward. That's the Jewish experience in a nutshell. And that was part of what I wanted to share with her.
I've checked this source of contemporary wisdom, Wikipedia.
Yes.
Yeah. And it says that I was very fascinated for a different reason, but that you lived in Montreal, where you grew up, in a project called Habitat.
Habitat
67
that's
also was on
true.
set. Habitat 66, 67, which was, I saw the picture, it was an extremely modernist building project, like beehives in concrete.
That's right. It was built by an Israeli architect named Moshe Safdie on the occasion of the World's Fair, the Montreal World's Fair, one of the last great World's Fairs. And what's funny about it, Per, is he built it as a kind of prototype for public housing, because the idea is that you would have each individual unit would have its own terrace, its own green space. It was a way of trying to incorporate green space into high-density housing. But it never really took off, and it exists as a kind of modernist experiment. Yeah. But no, we lived there. I grew up there.
The reason I ask it because one of the great influences on my personal intellectual was another New Yorker, Marshall Berman.
Yes.
As a Jewish Marxist intellectual of a Marxism of a type that only exists in the United States.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything vanishes into what was his.
Yeah, that's a great book about.
Yes.
And the greatest part is that he watches his childhood neighborhood in
Yes.
Bronx.
Yes.
And it's destroyed by the city planner Robert Moses building a highway. And Marshall Berman knows that he ought, as a modernist, as a part of this modernist tradition, Jewish American New York modernist tradition, he ought to be welcoming this new highway. But he feels he's angry. He hates Robert Moses.
Yes,
and this ambivalence, this paradox. Have you felt that? Because
oh, absolutely. He has a beautiful. Do you remember in that book? He has a beautiful vision of painting a mural, right? That would be of the Bronx that he has lost over time. Yes, that's a wonderful book, and of course it captures something that's very powerful. One of the things that's true, now, Berman was a Marxist, so he saw it as one of the destructive force of capitalism is to be constantly destroying the past and replacing the past with a new commodified present where we're all reduced to being mere consumers rather than being full citizens of places. It's a very passionate view. I don't share it entirely because I think that I think the experiment of socialist housing should disabuse us of the notion that the problems with cities arise from capitalism alone. Parenthetically, there's a fascinating new play that I had the chance to see in London not long ago about the confrontation of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, a great visionary of the organic city. That Ralph Fiennes is playing. It's coming to New York, and so if you're going to New York, take a look at it. My feeling about that is that that's built into the nature of modernity, of the gains and losses of modernity. On the one hand, we have the possibility of perpetual novelty, change, progress, and I use the word without scare quotes. Progress is a real thing. And we feel it. Each one of us today has in our pocket a computer more powerful than the ones that my mother was working on as a young computer scientist in 1961. Infinitely more powerful. We have all of human knowledge literally in our pocket. If we want to find what's the title of Marshall Berman's book, we click on it. At the same time, we see the destruction of community and continuity and things that we value from the past. That's not, I think, one of those things where you can, and this is where I would, in a certain sense, disagree with Marshall Berman. I think that we recognize, as citizens of modernity, enormous gains, enormous losses, and we're constantly engaged in a struggle to balance and to understand those two. Exactly where the idea of 1,000 small sanities, my idea of it, comes to play is that those are not conflicts that are susceptible to mega solutions. Those are not conflicts where you say, oh, the right thing is to destroy capitalism and replace it with a socialist government. Or
a unicorn.
Yes, that's a unicorn. Or to say, on the other hand, it's all fine. We can tear down anything we want, rebuild in any way we want, and that will be better. That's clearly also equally unsatisfactory. Instead, we have to do the hard, daily, difficult work of saying, this project and not that project, this building and not that building. Don't tear down Penn Station and don't tear down Grand Central, but build a new building, build new housing. One of the things in my hometown of New York that we need is more housing. Exactly the idea of 1,000 small sanities was not to say everything should happen slowly, but to recognize, because there are many things that I wish could happen overnight. one of the alternate titles for this book was Radicals of the Real, because there are so many things I wish we could do overnight. One of my causes, I write about endlessly and with complete futility in The New Yorker, changed nothing, but I write about it again and again, is gun control in America, gun violence. Without exaggeration, I've written 50 pieces about the need for gun sanity in America. Again and again, each time there's another horrific gun massacre, I write the same piece with slightly different sentences about it. And if I could have my way, we would have British, Swedish, Australian, Canadian gun laws in America tomorrow. But I recognize it, so it's not that I want things to happen slowly, not that I dream of an incremental, small step solution to the problem of gun violence. I would like it to happen tomorrow. But I recognize that I live in a country in which, for complicated historical reasons, there's a significant number of people, whether it's majority or not, we can debate, but a huge number of people who have a deep attachment to guns and to weapons, firearms, as symbols of liberty and autonomy. I can't wish those people away, and I can't eliminate those people, so I have to do everything I can to make small progress, to find areas of compromise, to locate, to work locally, to work on the state level, to do all of those things, exactly because I know that each time we make it a little bit harder for a teenager to get their hands on a military weapon, we're going much farther to eliminating the problem. One of the most profound lessons, I think, of modern sociology is exactly that if you don't have to build an 8-foot-tall wall to protect a house, you build a 2-foot-tall wall, and that discourages a lot of people from trying to jump over it. That's one of the reasons why crime had declined so much in New York. So, yes, absolutely, I think that we have to make that the theory of 1,000 small sanities is not to say, oh, well, we can wait, we can do everything in small steps. It's to recognize that in a pluralist society, you have to constantly be willing to make pluralist compromises in order to achieve the things you want urgently.
And there's a connection between this passionate thesis of the value of small steps and the great philosopher of science and political thought Karl Popper, which you mentioned in the book. And yesterday I learned that you actually met Karl Popper. That impressed me a lot.
So on 2 occasions.
On 2 occasions. You must tell us about that meeting Karl Popper.
So,
I think that's
yes,
equivalent to meeting a unicorn.
Yes, well, very interesting because you know how it is when we're young. We write letters to people we admire, and we expect to hear back from them. Now, I'm at the stage now in life when I get letters from young people, and I try, and about once a month, I remember to write back an email. I actually do better than that. And I wrote a letter. I was reading Popper's work when I was a teenager, and I thought, this is great. I read The Open Society and Its Enemies, which still seems to me one of the great defenses of democracy and free speech that exists. And I wrote him a letter saying, I'm a great admirer of yours. I'm going to be in England next year or in 6 months, so I would love to pay a call on you. And instead of saying, I'm busy, he said, by all means, come pay a call. I don't think he knew that I was 10 years old, or I was 19, I guess I was at that time. And I went and paid a visit on him, and he invited me back again. Popper, and it's always a good thing to go and meet our heroes and heroines because they always have feet of clay, and it's a very humanizing thing to recognize that the people we idolize are people before they are idols, that they are rhinoceroses rather than unicorns. And Popper, as some of you may have met, a genuinely great figure in the history of philosophy, was a great apostle of the value of criticism, that critical rationality was everything, and the seeking out that the reason science progressed was because it sought out empirical criticism of its theories instead of resisting it. Popper was, of all the human beings I've ever met, the one who resented criticism the most. And he was ferociously resentful of all his critics. And he would sit there and tell you everything that was wrong about everyone who had ever criticized him with the passion of a panther. And it wasn't hypocrisy. It was simply that he was so sensitive to the practice of criticism that he had made much of it, he had, in a way. And it made me aware of the principle that I have found to be almost infallibly true, which is that we all write at right angles to our real nature. And that the greatest humanists are often the most bitter misanthropes in life, the greatest humanists on the page, the people who are invariably, in my experience of writers, the writers who are most charming and urbane on the page are the most nervous and tense in person. That's not hypocrisy, as I say. That's the reason we write, is to become someone better than or different than the person that we are. But that was my experience with Popper, and it was one of the most instructive experiences of my life, both because I had a chance to meet my hero and because I realized that my hero had, if not feet of clay, then claws of iron, which he scratched out at his opponents.
Another figure that figures in your book, Liberal, was the British, was a journalist and an actor and a lot of other things, and he had a relationship with the author George Eliot, George Henry Lewis.
Yes.
And you write about him that he could say something clever about everything between heaven and earth. And I wonder, is there an element of self-identification in that portrait of Lewis?
You're a very sensitive reader, Per. Because yes, when I discovered, he's not a well-known figure now. He was a very important figure in the Victorian period. But George Henry Lewis was someone. He was an actor. He was a playwright. He was a critic. He was an essayist. He practiced all of those things. And yes, I identified very powerfully. Good, great ringtone there, guys. Yes, I will not pretend that I did not. I identified with him very much so. And not least, if I might add, because of all the good things he was. And he was astonishing polymath. And I may not be an astonishing polymath, but I'm some kind of a polymath. He was a fantastic husband. He discovered Marianne Evans, I use her real name, when she was a young woman just starting out writing. And he read a story of hers and said, "You are a writer, much better writer than I am." And he married, they never could officially get married because he had been married before, but they effectively got married, and he devoted himself to the writing of the author who became George Eliot, maybe the greatest of all English novelists. And he totally devoted his own life to her art. It does not happen very often in the history of literature that a man devotes himself single-mindedly to the work of a woman writer, but he did. So he's a hero of mine, and yes, I identify with him. Not least because he had an equal passion, as I do, for intellect, philosophy, liberal projects, and the theater.
And I would say that you're probably one of the few persons that are close to Isaiah Berlin as Irving Berlin.
Yes,
both the philosopher and the composer.
I tell this story very quickly, but we were talking about it the other night.
Yeah.
There's a great story. Everyone here knows Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish British philosopher. And during wartime in London, he was sending these brilliant signals, these brilliant letters back to Churchill in London, reporting on the American situation. So Churchill obviously invited him to lunch at 10 Downing Street when he heard that he was in London. But unfortunately, there was a miscommunication, and instead Irving Berlin, the great songwriter, was who they got at lunch. And Churchill interviewed him over and about what's going on in America. What do you think is likely to happen in the next election? And poor Irving Berlin, world's greatest songwriter, couldn't figure it out. And when Irving Berlin left the lunch, Churchill said, it's interesting. He's one of those men who writes so much more cogently than he speaks. And Irving Berlin saying, wow, Churchill is interested in everybody. He wanted my opinion on all these political issues. That's an absolutely true story. But yes, I would like, if I had a dream in life, it would be to combine Isaiah Berlin and Irving Berlin and be a bit of both.
And I know most of the audience know that, but you're also a lyricist and a librettist. You're actually writing musicals.
Yes, I am. You can go on Spotify, and if you Google me, or Spotify me, I have a musical called Our Table, which is on Spotify, which I narrate. Wonderful music by David Shire, who many of you will know from the movies, even if his name doesn't ring a bell immediately. He's won several Oscars for movie scores. Wonderful, amazing composer. And then I wrote a series of songs for a tribute to film noir, sung by a wonderful soprano named Melissa Errico. And you can also find that, the Film Noir Project, on Spotify. And that has, I think, 4 songs of mine on it. So yes, I am an essayist and a librettist, or lyricist as well.
That musical, Our Table, was based on a book by yourself.
Yes, it was
about food, actually.
Exactly
or
so.
restaurant.
Yes, exactly so. It was a book I wrote called The Table Comes First.
Yeah.
And David Shire, the wonderful composer, came to me and said, I think there's a musical in this book. And I said, okay, but we can write it together. And he said, oh, you would want to write a musical? And I said, yes, there's nothing else I'd rather do. So we ended up doing it. But if I may say, Per, just you've given me license to talk about the unity of my work.
Yeah.
And there again, the musical, Our Table, which if you listen to, I think has some charming, funny, it's a classic musical comedy. It's not very heavy in that way, but it has a heavy theme. It's about a couple struggling to maintain a little family restaurant in the middle of New York against all of the forces of real estate and of post-modernity, where you can only be a famous chef if you're on television, where you can only have a successful restaurant if you have a media connection of some kind. So it's very much a Marshall Berman theme about the struggle to maintain value, meaning, continuity in commercial culture.
And as I get it, you're writing on a musical right now, another one.
I'm writing two other musicals right now. I want to write the musical about the Berlins, Berlin at some point. But I'm writing one right now that I think is a bit of a. I'm writing it with a wonderful composer named Andrew Lippa, and it's about the moment when this will sound like the most improbable subject for a musical that has ever been, but in 1973, the American Psychological Association took homosexuality out of the list of disorders and made it just part of the human condition. And Andrew, who's gay, asked me years ago if I would work on this with him, because it's a wonderful human story about the debate and the struggle, and particularly between a father and son. The father is a psychologist, the son is gay but hasn't come out yet, and their struggle to make sense of each other in the context of this intellectual quarrel. And I thought it was really interesting because we've never had a musical that involves a professional conference, so I was drawn to it. And then I will tell you without betraying any confidences, because it's very public, I didn't think I was close enough to the material to write it. And then my wonderful daughter Olivia, the subject of this book, and who I've written about a great deal, came out herself, to my surprise, when she was in college as gay. And I wasn't shocked, I wasn't troubled, but I was surprised. And for the first time, I had all of the emotions, not negative emotions, but the complex emotions that come when we discover that our children have identities that we're not entirely prepared for, that surprise us. So I called Andrew and said, you know what? I'm ready to write that show now, if you're still game. And he said, I've been waiting 5 years for you to say yes. So we're in the middle of writing it. Now. And the struggle with that show, if I may say, and this once again I hope speaks to the continuities, what I hope are the thematic continuities in my work, and I'm at an age now when I'm allowed to talk about them without false modesty, is the one thing I've said to Andrew when we started work on the show is, listen, we have to make the bad guys as appealing as the good guys. In other words, it can't be fable where all the gay people are good and all the people who are opposed to taking homosexuality out of the manual are bad. I said, everybody has to have their story. Everybody has to have their reasons. Everybody has to have their own humanity. And that's my major obligation in doing it. It's not a story about bad people and good people. It's a story about people and about people struggling to make sense of their experience. It's, to use an odd but I think telling example, the reason why Fiddler on the Roof is such a successful show is because we identify with Tevye's love of tradition, but we also respect Tevye's love of his daughters. And his readiness to change his own values when his daughters want to marry men he despises and hates and thinks have the wrong values.
Time flies, so we have to wrap up soon. But I would like to say something about France, because it has something to do with your interest for food.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. And you have lived in France, and you're a member of the Légion d'honneur.
Yes.
You received that from Macron.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great thing.
It was cool, as my
It was
kids
cool.
say.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool.
It was cool.
And as a Canadian, I guess you're bilingual.
I was bilingual. It's been a long time since I've lived in France, and I find when I go back but yes, effectively.
So, what does France represent for you? Because I think it's an interesting relation between North Americans and France and Paris.
I did a whole anthology called Americans in Paris, just about this complicated relationship. You know, since the beginning of the United States, France has always been the other place. Right, that's Ben Franklin went to France, Thomas Jefferson went to France, Henry James went to France, James Baldwin. I mean, it's been the destination for American writers, particularly, long time. And what fascinates me about France at this moment in history, certainly when I was living there through most of the 1990s, is that France is still a place where people do things differently. It's an alternative civilization. You know, in most of the English-speaking world, we have a certain kind of uniform Americanization in the 90s, even in Britain. It was London was more like New York than it was like Paris. And Paris, in a way that can be maddening, that can be exasperating, that can be infuriating, that can make you swear, I will never set foot in this city again, is a place that's organized on different principles. It's as a different social organization. You know, simple things like in France, teachers are not socialized to smile instantly at children, right? And they're not. That's not their first social impulse. And when my son, who was going to school in France, came to America, and his first day in the school in New York, I said to him at the end of the day, I said, "How was it?" He said, "The teachers are too nice." He said, "They're too nice. Everything you do, they say is good." And he spotted, right, that there was a huge cultural difference and that it wasn't necessarily altogether positive, because he spotted the insincerity of American omnipresent universal affection. So France represents for me a place where people do things differently. France also represents for me, in a deep sense, I just finished a long piece for The New Yorker, it'll be out in a few weeks, about George Simenon, you know, the great mystery writer, the writer of the Inspector Maigret mysteries. And one of the things that fascinates us about Simenon and Maigret is that it's very morally ambivalent at every moment. You know, Maigret never, when Maigret finds the guilty party, he never says, "Aha," he always says, "Ah," because he recognizes some part of his own self in the sinner, in the criminal. He's closer to the criminal than not. And Francis had such a torturous and dangerous and difficult and bespoiled and history that one's always aware there of the moral ambivalence of the human condition. And the greatest French filmmakers and writers, Jean-Pierre Melville, I think of all the time, are acutely aware of that state. So I'm always drawn to Paris for all of the pleasures it provides, food and fashion and beauty. I don't diminish those things at all. I love those things. But it also has another underside that's very much part of the allure of Paris to someone who will never be French. I love and honor French civilization while still recognizing its weaknesses and its fragilities. I said that when they gave me the Légion d'honneur. I think they wanted to take it back at that point. I think.
And tomorrow you're off to another iconic place, to Venice.
Yes.
And you must tell us what are you going up to in Venice?
So
why Venice?
So this is this is either the most pleasing or embarrassing story I've ever been involved in. About a year and a half ago, I got an email from a film director named Todd Field, who's made a few wonderful movies, one called Little Children, which is extraordinary. And he said, "I've just finished writing a new movie for Cate Blanchett, and there's a part in it for a character whose name is Adam Gopnik." He said, "And I wonder if you would consider playing this part of this character named Adam Gopnik." And I thought it was like an elaborate joke, right? It was sort of a hoax. But sure enough, he sent me the script, or part of the script, and the opening scene was this character named Adam Gopnik, who's an essayist and a writer and a conversationalist, in conversation with this character named Lydia Tarr. It's going to be played by Cate Blanchett. And at first my instinct was to say, no, I don't do things like that. I'm degraded enough without pretending to be myself. And then he said, it's a shame you won't do it. He said, because Kate would love to work with you. She keeps saying she would just love to work with you, and we'd bring you to Berlin for a couple of weeks and put you and your wife up. So I said, let me call Mr. Gopnik to the phone at this point. And I accepted it. And this is a movie called Tar, and Kate is in the movie, and I am in the movie at the beginning. And it was an astonishing experience to be acting, even though I was playing the difficult part of me. It was fascinating to watch Kate Blanchett. My next book is called The Real Work, Studies on the Mystery of Mastery. It'll be out next year. And I hope eventually in Swedish. And what I study is, what is it to be a master of something? What is involved? And if you're not a master of something and you begin to study it, like studying life drawing, for instance, what you learn is that it's a series of steps, and that there's a direct relationship between your commitment to the craft and your ability to accomplish the craft. And working with Kate Blanchett, it was another lesson in that. If you watch her in the movies, she's this incandescent, beautiful, natural, and yet when you work with her, it's endless labor, analysis, going over every line, finding the psychological motivation. When she's not choosing to be beautiful, she's a mom. She's a mom with grown children. Then she knows when it's her time to be beautiful. It's seeing somebody who has spent a lifetime mastering the art of impersonation, of inhabiting another human being. And it was a lesson that nothing happens by accident. There's no natural genius. There's the joy and the necessity of craft and work. And that's the one more moral of the new book.
Yeah, and now it's opening in Venice, and you're off.
It's Venice. It's opening in Venice on Friday.
And you're off to the red carpet.
Yes. Well, I don't think they'll have me on the red carpet. They'll have her, but I'll be trailing behind her, throwing rose petals in her path.
So thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you so much, Paris. Pleasure talking to you.